some of the original blue light glasses. If you watch that video with the Oklahoma State Cowboy football team, these are the glasses they wear to help them get a good night of sleep. Okay, last few states of consciousness that we're going to look at. First of all, psychoactive drug states. So drugs that are going to have an effect on the nervous system and the mind, hence the psych in that term. 4 main categories that we're looking at: hallucinogens, opiates, depressants, and stimulants. Now, we're not in pharmacy school. We're in AP psychology. You go to pharmacy school, things get broken down into subcategories and all this kind of good stuff. We're not going to worry about that. Just the basics like Mr. Woodard was talking about on the last video. So first of all, hallucinogens. These are going to alter the perception of the external environment. If you remember freshman year when you watched the Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio, and they're going into the party, and Mercutio and Romeo both take drugs, they're taking a hallucinogen. So everything seems all weird and the external environment is all crazy. They're probably taking ecstasy, which isn't listed on this one, but it can be classified as a hallucinogen as well. So LSD was kind of the popular one in the 60s, kind of one of the famous ones. The CIA did a big experiment with LSD. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The author was big on research into LSD and personal research into LSD. Marijuana is classified as a hallucinogen, although you can see marijuana will actually find its way into different categories because of the different effects that it has on the psyche. Depressants. A lot of students will get this mixed up because of this. They see the word depressed. It doesn't mean that you're going to become depressed when you take one of these drugs, although that can be a side effect. You might have known somebody that doesn't drink very well, and they drink and they get really, really sad, or they already are in a kind of a sad state of mind. They drink and it becomes even worse. It can be a side effect, but that's not why they're called depressants. They're called depressants because they inhibit nerve impulses in the central nervous system. They depress the central nervous system. So for instance, with Valium, you might take Valium for anxiety or muscle spasms because there's something that's kind of ratcheted up in the central nervous system. So you're feeling anxious or your muscles are firing and they shouldn't be. So you take a depressant to inhibit some of those nerve impulses. Now, most people know that with alcohol, you oftentimes will lose self-awareness or self-control. It's funny, just a couple of hours ago, we were watching the Australian Open. Rafa Nadal was playing. This woman gets up in the crowd and starts yelling at him to hurry up and serve, and she's cussing. My first thought was, I bet she's been drinking. And they asked Nadal after the whole thing was over. She got kicked out of the stadium and everything. They said, oh, what did you think of that? And he just said, poor girl, she must have been drunk. Absolutely. You lose self-control. Why? Because you're not as aware of your surroundings because the central nervous system has been depressed. Okay? One kind of interesting study they've done over and over and over again is on this thing called expectancy effect. And if somebody thinks that they're drinking alcohol, they'll actually act like they're drunk. They'll feel like they're drunk even though they aren't. It's kind of like a placebo effect. Opiates. We've all heard of the tremendous issue that we have, not only in the country, but worldwide with opiates. Here's the main reason that opiates are so dangerous. As soon as you take an opiate, what happens is it's creating an artificial endorphin. Remember, endorphins inhibit pain, okay, or they help with pain. And so what happens is the artificial endorphins start to flow, and the brain says, oh, we don't need to make any natural endorphins. Well, on a short-term basis, you go in and you legitimately need some painkillers because you had your wisdom teeth pulled or whatever it might be, no worries. But if you do this for a little bit, then your brain is going to really slow the process down of making its natural endorphins. Well, what happens when your prescription runs out and you keep going back and you've gotten prescriptions over a period of time and the brain's not catching up? You need to go back and you need to go back. And they're highly, highly addictive because this process can be fairly quick for some people. True story, construction worker here in Spokane had a fall at work, hurt his back really bad, goes in, gets legitimate painkillers. He needed painkillers. He got the legitimate, doctor prescribed them correctly, etc. That pain, though, he could just never get ahead of. And he couldn't find any alternative therapies. So he kept hanging on to the opiates, and he kept hanging on to the opiates. And after a while, the brain shut down and those natural endorphins weren't working. And his mood started to alter, because then what happens is you get really, really upset when when that pain is still around. And it's this, you can see I'm ratcheting up because it's this cycle. And then lost his job. So now doesn't have insurance or money to go to the doctor to get the opiates. In some cases, the doctors will just shut you down if you keep coming back because they think that you're a drug seeker. So what happened to this guy? Legitimate construction worker that had a fall at work. He wasn't properly taken care of after a long period of time. He ends up finding heroin on the street, because heroin is going to be that cheap alternative. And the heroin that's out on the street is laced with stuff that you can't even imagine somebody would put into their bodies. Okay? So those are opiates, and I wanted to take a little bit extra time on the opiates simply because that is such a phenomenal problem in our world right now, and that's why it's just very easy to get addicted. Another quick little story, by the way, when this whole opioid crisis was just getting going, knew a student at LC that broke his pinky. Went into the doctor because there was some pain there. It was broken. It wasn't like a bone sticking around or anything. There was some pain. Doctor prescribed 16 hydrocodone pills for that little broken pinky. That's one of the reasons we have a problem in the U.S. right now, and why those are being mitigated through the court system right now. Okay. And then opposite of depressants are going to be stimulants. Depressants depress the central nervous system. Stimulants are going to arouse the nervous system. The most widely used drug in the world is caffeine through coffee. Now, I have a couple of extra cups of coffee on a day. I don't feel good. I get jittery. Stomach doesn't feel well. I just don't feel right the rest of the day. That's not going to have any crazy long-term effects for me. However, you take too much of one of these, obviously real bad things happen in a hurry, or an extended exposure to these. Somebody that gets addicted and is having it quite a bit wreaks havoc on the body. So those are stimulants. I think this one is pretty self-explanatory as far as what other forms of consciousness take. You can read that here. And finally, the last slide is going to be sensory deprivation and meditation. And really, if we have time in class, I'd love to show you these videos, because sensory deprivation, they actually took some volunteers and deprived them of sleep, and they actually can narrate their hallucinations. It's fascinating. Then they have a prisoner of war who recounts the hallucinations. He was locked in a room without any light for, I think, months on end. And he talks about the hallucinations he had, what he saw, what he heard. It's interesting to watch him because he'll get really, really agitated when he starts to kind of relive some of those sensory deprivation. And meditation is what we'll end with. Meditation is really cool because it creates lower frequency alpha waves. If you remember Mr. Woodard's mnemonic, BAT, beta waves are wakefulness, alpha waves are relaxed wakefulness, theta waves are that first stage of sleep. So meditation can create alpha waves, which sounds really cool right now to me. So I think I'm going to pop these back on and go meditate a little bit and relax. That's chapter 5, everyone. See you in chapter 6.